On November 23rd, 1888, while every cabin in Redstone Canyon was losing its battle against the storm, a 14-year-old girl sat cross-legged inside a crack in the canyon wall, feeding a small fire that burned cleaner than any hearth in the territory. Outside, the temperature had dropped 45 degrees in 8 hours. The wind screamed through the canyon like something wounded and desperate. Snow did not fall from the sky. It flew sideways, hard as sand, cutting any flesh foolish enough to be exposed. 9 people were about to squeeze through that crack in the stone. One of them was the man who had thrown her out 2 months earlier with $9 and told her to disappear before she became an embarrassment. She would save them all. But 4 months before that frozen November night, Linnea Whitmore had never banked a fire and rock in her life. She had never slept alone in the wilderness. She had never gone a single night without her mother's voice telling her that everything would somehow be all right. Everything changed in the summer of 1888. She came to the canyon settlement in July with her mother Ellen, whose cough had already settled deep in her chest and whose hope had already begun to fade behind her eyes. Ellen Whitmore had been born in Bergen, Norway, the daughter of a baker who understood that fire was only half of what kept a house warm. The other half was stone. Stone remembered heat, he taught her. Stone held what it was given and released it slowly, long after the flames themselves had died. Ellen carried that knowledge across an ocean, through Ellis Island, across a continent to a place called Redstone Canyon in the Arizona Territory. She carried it in her bones the way she carried the sickness that was slowly stealing her breath. Silas Whitmore had married Ellen for practical reasons. He needed someone to cook and clean and manage his small cattle operation while he checked fence lines and negotiated with buyers in town. He did not marry her for the daughter she brought along, a quiet girl of 14 who ate more than she earned and watched everything with pale, knowing eyes. Linnea had her mother's eyes. She had her mother's stillness, that quality of watching without speaking, of learning without asking. She had hands already rough from work and a mind that remembered everything it was taught. She also had a dog. Copper was a rust-colored mutt with brown eyes and one ear that never quite stood straight. He had followed them all the way from Missouri, sleeping at the foot of Linnea's bed every night since she was 11 years old. He was not large. He was not particularly brave. But he was loyal in the way that only a dog can be loyal, with a devotion that asked nothing in return. By August, Ellen was dying. The consumption had settled into her lungs like a permanent guest, and no amount of Arizona sunshine could burn it out. She spent her last weeks in the small back bedroom of Silas Whitmore's cabin, coughing blood into rags that Linnea washed and dried and washed again, her hands raw from the lye soap, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. Silas did not enter that room. He said the sickness might spread, but Linnea knew the truth. He simply did not want to watch. He had married a worker, not a patient, and now that Ellen could no longer work, she had become an inconvenience. On the night Ellen died, she called her daughter to her bedside. The kerosene lamp threw dancing shadows across the rough plank walls. Copper lay in the doorway, watching with the patient alertness of an animal who understands that something is ending. The air smelled of sage and sickness and the particular sweetness of a body preparing to let go. Ellen's hand found Linnea's in the darkness. Her fingers were cold. The bones were too close to the skin. She had become so thin in these final weeks that she barely made a shape beneath the blankets. "Listen to me," Ellen whispered. Her voice was almost gone, a thread of sound that might snap at any moment. "Stone remembers heat, Linnea. Long after fire dies, stone gives back what it took. My mother taught me in Bergen. Her mother taught her. Now you know." Linnea squeezed her mother's hand. She did not fully understand. Not yet. Not in the way that understanding would come later, when her life depended on it. "The chain," Ellen said. "Don't let it break." Those were her last words. Linnea buried her mother on a hillside overlooking the wash. In a grave she dug herself because Silas said he could not spare the labor. The ground was hard. Her shoulders burned. Her palms blistered and the blisters broke, and she kept digging anyway. She marked the grave with a flat stone and a wooden cross fashioned from fence posts. Copper sat beside her the entire time, not moving, not making a sound. When it was done, she stood looking down at the raw earth for a long time. "I won't let it break," she said quietly. "I promise." 3 weeks later, on the morning of October 3rd, 1888, Silas Whitmore called Linnea outside. He did it in front of the trading post, in full view of half the settlement. He did it in daylight so there would be witnesses, so everyone would remember that he had not thrown her out naked or starving. So the story, when it was told later in kitchens and at dinner tables, would paint him as a reasonable man who had done what he could. He handed her a flour sack cut down to perhaps 8 pounds. Inside was a single change of clothes, a dented copper kettle, and her mother's bone comb, the one Ellen had carried all the way from Norway. He pressed $9 in mixed coins into her palm. $9. I gave you more than your mother's coughing ever earned, Silas said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. That was worse than shouting. Shouting would have meant he felt something. This calm meant she had never mattered at all. You can hire yourself somewhere before the roads close. That's more of a chance than most get. Linnea stood on the wooden boardwalk with copper pressed against her leg. The morning sun was warm on her face. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of autumn sky that made winter seem like a distant rumor, something that happened to other people in other places. She was 14 years old. She had $9. She had a dog, a kettle, and her mother's comb. Winter was 6 weeks away. I want to pause here and ask you something. She was 14 with $9, a dog, and no one in the world who cared whether she lived or died. Winter was coming. The nearest town was over 20 miles away through dangerous country. She had no family, no friends, no one who would take her in. What would you have done? Take a moment. Think about it. Think about what it would feel like to stand on that boardwalk with nothing but a flour sack and a dog, and the knowledge that everyone watching expected you to fail. Leave your answer in the comments. Then let us continue. The arithmetic of her situation was simple and fatal. $9 might buy her 2 weeks of floor space in someone's shed, but 2 weeks would end, and then she would be standing in the same place with nothing. The nearest trade stop sat 22 miles south through broken canyon country. The roads would close with the first heavy snow. She could not cut timber alone. She could not haul logs without a team of horses. She could not build walls, frame a roof, or lay a chimney before winter buried the passes. She could not leave because leaving required money for passage, relatives willing to claim her, or work waiting somewhere else. She had none of these things. A girl alone in canyon country in winter was a girl who died in canyon country in winter. Everyone knew this. Everyone accepted it. The only question was whether she would die quickly, in a storm, or slowly, of cold and hunger, in some shallow overhang where they would find her bones come spring. Gideon Marsh found her that afternoon. He was 60 years old, his face carved by weather and grief into something that resembled the canyon walls themselves. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes. His beard was more gray than brown. His hands, holding the reins of his mule, were spotted and scarred from decades of hard work. Gideon had driven supply wagons between Flagstaff and Prescott for 12 seasons. He knew the territory the way a man knows his own body, every ridge and wash and hidden seep. He also knew what happened to people who underestimated the cold. 12 years earlier, in the winter of 1876, Gideon had lost his wife Sarah and his 4-year-old son Jacob. They had been 50 feet from their cabin door. 50 feet. Sarah had gone out to check on a cow that was calving. Jacob had followed her, the way 4-year-olds follow their mothers, not because they are needed, but because they cannot bear to be left behind. The storm hit without warning, a wall of white that erased everything. Gideon had been inside stoking the fire when he heard Sarah call out. By the time he reached the door, he could not see his own hand in front of his face. He searched for 3 hours in that storm. He searched until his fingers turned white, and the feeling left his feet, and something in his chest that had always been warm went cold and stayed cold. He found them 3 months later when the snow finally melted. They had died within reach of home. 50 feet. He never remarried. He never stopped moving. Movement was how he survived. If he kept moving, he did not have to think about what he had lost. Now he sat on his mule at the edge of the wash and looked down at a 14-year-old girl sitting on a boulder with a rust-colored dog at her feet. She was staring at the sandstone walls like they might offer answers. "Whitmore's girl," he said. It was not a question. Linnea looked up at him. "Not anymore." Gideon dismounted slowly, his joints protesting the way they always protested these days. He walked a careful circle around her, taking inventory the way he inventoried cargo before a winter run. Thin coat, cracked boots, no blanket visible, the flour sack and kettle beside her on the rock. The dog watching him with calm, intelligent eyes, its body positioned between the girl and the stranger. You planning to winter here? I'm planning to survive. Gideon laughed, but there was no cruelty in it, just exhaustion. Just the weight of everything he had seen in 60 years of living. Girl, I've crossed 12 cold seasons through this territory. I've seen men with axes and teams and full supply wagons freeze because they misjudged the weather by 3 days. He crouched beside her, bringing his eyes level with hers. You have no axe, you have no team, you have no sawbuck, no shingles, no nails for a door. His voice dropped. A child sleeping in stone in January is a child they'll find frozen by dawn. That's not opinion. That's arithmetic. Linnea said nothing. There was nothing to say. Everything he told her was true. The canyon doesn't negotiate, Gideon said. He mounted his mule. Find someone to take you in, or find a way south before the roads close. Those are your choices. He rode away without looking back. For 2 days, Linnea walked the canyon margins, looking for something she could not name. She had no plan. She had only the knowledge that every conventional path was closed to her. Renting a bed corner cost money. Service in another household meant the same dependency she had just escaped. A man's household, a man's rules, a man's right to throw her out again when she became inconvenient. Building a brush lean-to would fail under the first heavy snow. A tent was impossible. A cabin was absurd. She slept the first night in a shallow overhang, curled around a handful of coals she kept alive by feeding them juniper twigs. Copper lay against her back, sharing what warmth he had. The cold crept into her bones by midnight. By dawn, her fingers were too stiff to strike a match properly. The second night, she found a deeper alcove and built a larger fire. The smoke pooled around her until she woke coughing, eyes streaming, lungs burning. She crawled out into the freezing air and lay gasping on the sandstone while Copper licked her face and whined with concern. She was going to die. She understood this now, with the clarity that comes only when survival becomes uncertain. The canyon would take her the way it had taken so many others, and in spring they would find what remained, and Silas Whitmore would shake his head and say he had given her a chance. On the third day, half faint from thirst and hunger, she found the crack. It was narrow, barely wider than her shoulders, hidden behind a slab of fallen rock that had come loose from the canyon wall sometime in the distant past. She would have walked right past it if she had not stopped to rest, pressing her back against the cool stone. Something made her hold still, a faint pull of air against her face, cold air moving outward from the stone itself. The rock was breathing. Copper's ears pricked forward. He pushed his nose toward the crack and sniffed, his crooked ear twitching, his tail beginning a slow wag. Linnea struck a match and held it near the opening. The flame bent inward, then steadied, then bent again, as if the rock itself were exhaling. She squeezed through. The passage angled downward for perhaps 10 feet, scraping her shoulders on both sides. Copper followed, his claws clicking against the stone. Then it opened. She could not see the full space in the matchlight, but she could feel it. A chamber large enough to stand in. Dry, the air cool but not freezing. She lit another match and walked deeper. The stone beneath her feet was flat and smooth, worn by water that had not flowed here in decades or perhaps centuries. The walls rose perhaps 8 feet before curving into a ceiling of layered sandstone. At the far end, a narrow fissure climbed upward into darkness. She held a burning twig beneath that fissure. The smoke rose. It did not pool. It did not roll back. It did not fill the chamber. It climbed. The chamber breathed. Linnea stood there in the fading light of her last match and remembered her mother's voice in the darkness of that final night. Stone remembers heat. Long after fire dies, stone gives back what it took. This chamber was an oven turned inside out. If she could build a small fire near that venting fissure, if the draft continued to pull the smoke upward, if she could create a sleeping space away from the cold floor. The match burned her fingers. She dropped it and stood in absolute darkness. The chamber breathing around her, Copper's warm body pressed against her leg. It would not be a house. It would be a grave if she was wrong. But if she was right, it would be the only shelter she could build alone. Oralee Brennan found her the next morning, hauling flat stones toward the canyon wall. Oralee was 16, sharp-featured and practical, the daughter of a widow who lived 2 miles north along the bench. She had watched Linnea's expulsion from the trading post without saying anything. There had been nothing to say. These things happened. They happened all the time in places like this, where survival was never guaranteed and sentiment was a luxury few could afford. Now she stood at the wash's edge, arms crossed, watching Linnea struggle with a slab of sandstone that weighed more than she did. Copper sat nearby, panting in the morning sun, watching his person work. "You're not building a house," Oralee said. Linnea dropped the stone and straightened, breathing hard. "No." "Well, then what are you doing?" "Surviving." Oralee walked closer. Her eyes followed the path Linnea had worn in the dust, from the pile of flat stones near the wash to the hidden crack in the canyon wall. "You found a hole in the rock." "I found a chamber. It vents. The draft pulls upward through a fissure at the back." "A hole," Oralee repeated. "You're going to sleep in a hole." "I'm going to build a firebox, a smoke baffle, and a raised sleeping platform. The stone will hold heat after the fire dies. The narrow entrance will block wind. The chamber is dry. The draft is real." Oralee stared at her for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not cruel exactly, but disbelieving. "Linnea, you're not building a shelter. You're burying yourself where no one can hear you cough. You'll die of smoke or cold or a rockfall that seals you in, and no one will know until spring when they find your bones. Then no one will have to dig a grave." "That's not funny." "It wasn't meant to be." Oralee did not help her, but she did not leave either. She sat on a boulder and watched Linnea haul 3 more stones before the sun reached its peak. When Linnea finally stopped to drink from her water skin, Oralee spoke again. "The smoke, how do you know it will keep pulling?" "I tested it with burning sage. The draft is steady." "What if it changes in winter? What if the fissure ice is over?" Linnea had no answer. That was the gamble. "If you die in there," Oralee said, "my mother will say I should have stopped you." "You can't stop me. No one can. I have no other choice." Oralee stood. She looked at the crack in the canyon wall, then back at Linnea. "You're either the smartest person in this canyon or the maddest. I can't tell which." She walked away, but the next morning she came back with a sack of coarse salt and an old coffee tin. She did not explain why. She simply left them beside Linnea's stone pile and disappeared down the wash. The hostile pressure began the day Linnea returned to the trading post for scrap iron. Silas was waiting. He had heard, of course. In a settlement this small, everyone heard everything. The girl sleeping in a hole in the canyon wall. The girl hauling stones like a mad creature. The girl who refused to die properly or disappear conveniently. He caught her arm as she reached for the bin of bent nails and rusted hinges. "I hear you've made yourself a grave." His voice was calm, almost friendly. That was worse than shouting. "I've made myself a shelter." "A shelter?" Silas smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "A hole in the ground where decent people can't see you. A place where animals live and things rot. That's what you call a shelter." The trading post owner watched from behind his counter. 2 women paused their conversation near the dry goods. Everyone was listening. "A hole that keeps heat," Linnea said quietly, "is finer than a house that throws me out." Silas's grip tightened on her arm. "You watch your mouth, girl. I fed you. I gave you a roof. I gave you more than your mother's coughing ever earned. You gave me $9 and told me to disappear before I embarrassed you. I gave you a chance." He released her arm and stepped back, performing for the audience now, making sure everyone could see what a reasonable man he was. "The truth is simple. She's turned wild, living in stone like an animal, probably stealing from decent people to survive. I warned her this would happen if she didn't find proper work, but some people can't be helped." Linnea took the bent nails and the scrap iron and paid with one of her remaining dollars. She did not look at Silas again, but as she left, she heard him speaking to the trading post owner. "If she comes around begging, don't encourage it. Help one stray, and you'll have every lost creature in the district knocking for bread." Copper growled low in his throat as they walked away. Linnea put her hand on his head to quiet him. They would see. They would all see. The mentor arrived on the fifth day of construction. Declan Morrow was 68 years old, with lungs scarred by 15 years of copper mine dust and a knee that had never healed right after a mule kicked it in 1873. He was born in County Cork, Ireland, had built ovens and hearths in the Cornish mines of England before crossing the Atlantic, and now lived alone in a wagon lean-to 2 miles down the Wash, doing odd repair work for whoever would pay. He found Linnea selecting flat stones from a slide of broken sandstone, testing each one by tapping it with a smaller rock and listening to the ring. "That one'll split," he said. Linnea looked up. She had not heard him approach. Copper was already on his feet, tail wagging cautiously. "It has a crack running through the middle," Declan continued. His accent was thick, the consonants soft around the edges. "You can see it if you look along the grain. Put that near a fire and it'll break apart within a week." He walked past her and picked up a different stone, one she had discarded. "This one. You hear how the sound's different? Solid all the way through. This is what you want for a firebox." "How do you know about fireboxes?" "I was a stonemason for 11 years before my lungs gave out. Built ovens, hearths, chimneys, mine kitchens." He set the stone down and studied her with pale blue eyes that seemed to look straight through to the bone. "Whitmore's girl, the one sleeping in the canyon." "Not sleeping yet. Building." "Show me." She did not know why she trusted him. Perhaps because he had corrected her work instead of mocking it. Perhaps because he looked at the stones the way she did, as materials rather than madness. She led him to the crack in the canyon wall. Copper went first, disappearing into the darkness like a scout. Declan squeezed through the narrow entrance with difficulty, his bad knee scraping against the rock. But once inside the chamber, he stood very still, looking at everything. The flat floor, the rising walls, the venting fissure at the back. He picked up a handful of dust and released it near the fissure. The particles drifted upward. "You found this yourself?" "3 days ago. And you understood what it meant." "My mother taught me about bread ovens, how enclosed stone holds heat." Declan nodded slowly. He walked the perimeter of the chamber, running his hand along the walls, testing the floor with his boot. "The draft is good," he said finally. "Not perfect. You'll need to manage it. But good. The chamber is dry. The stone is solid." He turned to face her. "You have the right idea, but your execution will kill you." "What do you mean?" "The firebox you're planning. Where were you going to put it?" Linnea pointed to a spot near the entrance where she had begun stacking stones. "Wrong." Declan walked toward the back of the chamber. "Put it there, and the smoke will roll back before it finds the fissure. You need to build closer to the draft path." He walked to her pile of stones and picked up one of the flat slabs. "And your stones. You've been standing them on edge. They need to lie on their natural bed. Stand them up and the heat cycling will crack them within days." He set the stone down and looked at her. His eyes were kind, but his voice was not. "I can teach you to do this right, but only if you're willing to tear apart everything you've already built and start over." Linnea looked at the stones she had spent 2 days hauling. Hours of work. Her shoulders ached. Her hands were raw. "Teach me." Declan Morrow did not teach by lecturing. He taught by doing. On the first day, he made her rebuild the firebox foundation 3 times. The first attempt, he scattered with his boot without explanation. The second, he pointed to a gap between 2 stones where smoke would escape sideways. The third, he studied for a long moment before nodding. Better. Not good, but better. The firebox took shape over the next 2 weeks. 30 inches wide at the opening, 20 inches deep, 24 inches high. Declan showed her how to select stones that would nest together without gaps, how to use clay-rich mud only where needed, how to test every course by trying to rock it before adding the next. "A firebox is not a wall," he said. "A wall stands still. A firebox breathes. It expands when hot and contracts when cold. If you build it rigid, it'll tear itself apart. If you build it loose, the smoke will escape. You want tension. You want stones that want to hold together, not stones you forced." He showed her how to test the draft with different fuels. Damp sage for heavy smoke, dry peon for lighter trails, twisted rabbit brush for quick bursts. He made her crouch with her cheek near the floor and watch the smoke move. "There, he said, pointing to a spot where the smoke hesitated before rising. You see that? That's where you need a baffle. A lip of stone that guides the flow upward instead of letting it pool. The baffle took 2 days to build. A single course of flat stones projecting inward from the wall, positioned to catch the rising heat and redirect it toward the venting fissure. Declan made her tear it out twice before he was satisfied. Too far and you choke the draft. Too short and it does nothing. You're looking for the edge where the air wants to climb. Find that edge, and the fire does your work for you. Copper watched everything from his spot near the sleeping platform. Sometimes he would pick up a small stick and carry it over to where they were working, dropping it at Linnea's feet like an offering. Declan would smile at that, the lines in his weathered face softening. Good dog, knows how to help. At night, after Declan returned to his lean-to, Linnea stayed in the chamber and practiced what he had taught her. She built small fires and watched the smoke. She adjusted the baffle by fractions of an inch. She learned to feel the draft against her face, to sense when the air was moving right and when something was wrong. The sleeping platform came next. Declan showed her how to build stone piers, stable and level and weight-bearing, and lay poles across them to hold a brush mattress. Why off the floor? She asked. Cold air sinks. If you sleep on stone, the cold will pull the heat from your body all night. Get yourself 18 inches up, and you'll be sleeping in the warmest air the chamber holds. By the third week, the shelter was becoming real. The firebox worked. The baffle guided the smoke. The sleeping platform was solid enough to hold her weight without creaking. She had begun splitting her fuel between an inner cache near the back wall and an outer stack under a stone overhang outside the entrance. But the construction was not the only work. Every day she gathered fuel: juniper for quick hot flame, piñon for slower coals, dead brush for kindling. She learned to estimate how much she would need for a night, then a week, then a storm. The numbers were terrifying. To survive a 3-day blizzard without leaving the chamber, she would need perhaps a quarter quart of mixed wood. She had barely half that stacked. Every day she hauled water from the seep at the canyon's mouth, a 3-mile round trip with a heavy water skin. The water was silty and tasted of minerals, but it was water. Every day she felt the season closing around her. The nights grew colder. Frost appeared on the canyon rim at dawn. The settlement's livestock were being moved to winter pastures. Silas's neighbors were checking their chinking and stacking fuel against their cabin walls. And every day the skeptics continued. Let me pause here and share something with you. Stone steals heat, then gives it back. That is what Linnea's mother taught her. It sounds simple, almost too simple to matter, but sometimes the deepest wisdom comes wrapped in the plainest words. Have you ever heard something like that? A piece of advice from a parent or grandparent that sounded ordinary at the time, but turned out to be profound? Something you did not understand until years later, when life taught you what the words really meant? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now let us continue. Reverend Josiah Blackwood came on a Tuesday afternoon, his black coat flapping in the autumn wind. He was a tall man with a voice built for sermons and a certainty in his eyes that never wavered. He had been in the territory for 15 years, building his congregation one soul at a time, and he believed without question that he knew what was best for everyone in it. He found Linnea stacking stones near the chamber entrance and stood watching her for several minutes before he spoke. Child, Linnea did not stop working. Reverend, I've heard what you're doing here, hiding in holes, living in darkness like a creature forsaken by God. She set down a stone and straightened. Copper moved to stand beside her, his ears flat. Come to the church. We will find you a proper Christian home, a family to take you in. This is not the path the Lord intends for his children. The Lord intended for me to be thrown out with $9? Blackwood's expression flickered, but only for a moment. Silas Whitmore is a hard man, but his hardness does not excuse yours. Pride is a sin, girl. Pride before a fall. Linnea picked up another stone. Thank you for your concern, Reverend. This place will be your coffin. Then I'll already be buried. Blackwood left with his certainty intact, though something troubled moved across his face as he walked away. He would tell the congregation that the Whitmore girl had turned wild, that grief and hardship had broken something in her soul. He would pray for her at Sunday service, but he would not help her. Emmett Holloway came the following day. He was 45, a carpenter who had built 30 cabins in the territory and survived 19 winters. His hands were thick with calluses. His eyes were sharp with experience. He had come to see for himself what the girl was building. He did not enter the chamber. He stood at the entrance and looked in, his lantern throwing shadows across the stone walls. "I've built 30 cabins in this territory, girl. Lived through 19 winters. I know what keeps the cold out and what doesn't." Linnea waited. "That hole will be your coffin. Stone doesn't keep heat. It steals it. Every miner knows that. You go underground, you freeze faster than you would on the surface." "Stone steals heat," Linnea said quietly. "Then stone gives it back." Holloway laughed. "Where'd you hear that nonsense?" "My mother." The laughter stopped. Something shifted in Holloway's face, a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly buried. "Your mother's dead, and you will be too before Christmas, if you don't find proper shelter." He walked away, but he looked back once, and in that look was something that might have been doubt. The gossip spread through Cordelia Pruitt. She was the wife of the trading post owner, a woman whose chief occupation was knowing everyone else's business. She held court near the dry goods most afternoons, her voice carrying to every corner of the small building. "Poor thing's lost her mind, living in a hole like a badger. Grief does that to children. Someone should take that dog away before she eats it." The women who listened clucked their tongues. Some felt pity, some felt relief that it was not their daughter, their sister, their problem. At the saloon that evening, Cormac Tully raised his glass. He was 19, the son of a ranch owner, with more money than sense and more opinions than either. His red hair caught the lamplight as he grinned at the men around him. $5 says the Norwegian girl's dead before Christmas. Who's in?" 7 men took the bet, but not everyone mocked. Astrid Lindqvist came on a cold morning in late October. She was 72 years old, born in Dalarna, Sweden, and had come to America in 1842 as a young bride. Her husband had died 30 years ago. Her children had scattered across the country. She lived alone in a small cabin 3 miles from the settlement, surviving on stubbornness and the skills her mother had taught her. She found Linnea testing stones near the wash and stood watching in silence for 20 minutes. Copper approached her cautiously, sniffed her hand, and wagged his tail. "Your mother," Astrid finally said. Her accent was still thick after all these years. "She was from Norway?" Linnea looked up. "Bergen." "I knew it." Astrid smiled, and the lines of her face rearranged themselves into something warm. "The way you test stones, the way you read smoke. My husband's mother built ovens like this in Sweden. Round stones hold. Flat stones breathe. Your mother taught you well." It was the first time since Ellen's death that anyone had spoken of her knowledge with respect. "I'm trying to survive," Linnea said. "I know." Astrid reached out and touched her shoulder. "The old ways are not dead. They only sleep until someone needs them again." She did not offer help. She was too old, too frail. But she had given something more valuable. Validation. There was one other person who did not mock. Matthias Vance came to the settlement twice a month, driving a freight wagon between Flagstaff and the outlying homesteads. He was 23 years old, quiet in the way of men who spend most of their time alone on the road, with steady hands and eyes that noticed things other people missed. He found Linnea at the trading post one afternoon, buying the last of the scrap iron with coins she could not afford to spend. Cordelia Pruitt was holding court nearby, her voice carrying across the room. "Living in a hole like a badger. Someone should put that girl out of her misery." Matthias set down the harness he had been examining and walked to the counter. He did not look at Cordelia. He did not acknowledge that she had spoken at all. "You're building something," he said to Linnea. It was not a question. "A shelter. In the canyon wall. I heard." He pulled a small bundle from his coat pocket. Matches, perhaps 50 of them, wrapped in oilcloth. "These stay dry better than the ones they sell here. Wax dipped." He set them on the counter beside her purchases. "For the shelter." Before she could respond, he picked up his harness and walked out. Copper, sitting at her feet, wagged his tail. The last lesson came on a cold evening in early November. Declan's lungs had been getting worse as the temperature dropped. His breath rattled in his chest like stones in a tin cup. Walking the 2 miles to the chamber had become a struggle. But he came anyway because There was one more thing she needed to know. He found her building a fire in the completed firebox, the flames casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Copper lay on the sleeping platform, watching with half-closed eyes. "When you're cold and scared and the storm's howling outside," Declan said, lowering himself onto a stone near the fire, "every part of you will want to pile on fuel and make the biggest fire you can." Linnea looked at him. "Don't." "Why?" "Because a big fire burns through your fuel in hours. A big fire throws smoke that overwhelms the draft. A big fire heats the air so fast the stone can't absorb it. And when that fire dies, you're colder than before." He knelt beside the firebox and built a small pyramid of kindling. "A small fire tended steady is worth more than a bonfire that eats everything and dies. You pre-warm stones near the box. You dry damp wood on a rack. You bank coals under ash so your morning relight costs you 1 match instead of 5. He lit the fire and stepped back. "Think in days, not hours." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the firelight, his eyes were bright with something that might have been pride. "Fire is not your enemy. Panic is your enemy. Keep your head, and this place will keep you alive. Lose your head, and the stone will bury you." "I won't be able to come when the storms start," he said. "My lungs can't take walking in cold air. But you know enough now. More than enough. What if something goes wrong?" "Something will go wrong. Something always goes wrong. You won't have predicted it. You won't have prepared for it. And you'll have to solve it alone with what you have in that moment." He reached out and gripped her shoulder. "That's when you find out what you're made of." "I'm scared." "Good. Fear keeps you careful. Just don't let it keep you stupid." He smiled, and for a moment the lines in his face softened, and she could see the young man he had been, building ovens in Cornwall, learning the secrets of stone and fire. "You listen better than any apprentice I ever had. You see what I'm showing you instead of just watching. That's rare." He stood slowly, his knee protesting. "Whatever happens, remember that. You saw, you learned, and you'll pass it on." Copper walked him to the entrance, tail wagging, as if saying goodbye. "A small fire tended steady is worth more than a bonfire that eats everything and dies." I think that might be one of the most important survival lessons I have ever heard. And maybe it applies to more than just fire. Maybe it applies to how we spend our energy, how we approach our problems, how we live our lives. Do you agree? What does that wisdom mean to you? Pause for a moment and think about it. Then let us continue. Gideon Marsh returned in mid-October on his last supply run before the roads closed for winter. He found Linnea hauling deadfall from a side canyon and stopped his wagon. "Still here?" It was not quite a question. "Still here. Show me what you've built." She led him to the chamber entrance. Gideon studied the narrow crack for a long moment, then squeezed through. Inside, he stood in the center of the space, turning slowly. He looked at the firebox, the baffle, the sleeping platform, the stacked fuel. He walked to the venting fissure and held his palm beneath it. "Draft's pulling. It's been steady since I found it. For now." He turned to face her. "What happens when the fissure ice is over? When snow blocks the entrance? When the temperature outside drops so fast the pressure changes and the draft reverses?" "I've thought about those things. Thinking isn't surviving." He walked to the entrance and paused. "I've seen men die in simpler shelters than this. I've seen a road camp of 12 men lose 4 in a single night because their fire threw smoke the wrong way and they couldn't wake up to fix it." He looked at her, and in his eyes was something that might have been respect. "This is not a cabin. This is not a proven thing. This is a gamble. This is faith." "Everything is a gamble." "No. Some things are arithmetic." He squeezed back through the entrance. When Linnea followed, he was already mounted. "You've done better than I expected. But fair weather proves nothing. A warm October test is not a January storm. When the real cold comes, when the wind changes and the snow falls and everything you've built is tested at the same time, that's when you'll know if you were smart or lucky." He rode away. Linnea watched him go and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He was not wrong. By November 15th, 1888, Linnea's shelter held everything she had been able to gather. 10 to 12 days of fuel, stacked in 2 caches, a sleeping platform with a brush mattress 6 inches thick, a supply of dried meat and hard bread, purchased with her last $3. A water skin that could hold 2 days' supply if she rationed carefully. The wax-dipped matches Matthias had given her, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a dry crevice. Copper curled at her feet every night, his warmth as essential as the fire. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but it was everything she had. The first real test came on a clear night when the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Linnea built her fire exactly as Declan had taught her. Small, steady, tended with patience. She positioned herself on the sleeping platform and watched the draft. Outside, 28 degrees. Inside, with the fire burning, 52 degrees. She slept in her shirt that night, with Copper's warm body against her legs. The stone walls held the heat long after the flames had died to coals. By morning, the chamber was still warmer than the air outside. It worked. But as Gideon Marsh had said, fair weather proved nothing. The signs began on November 22nd. Astrid Lindqvist noticed first. She had lived through enough winters to read the sky the way others read newspapers. That color, she said, looking west. I've seen it twice in 50 years. Both times people died. The pressure changed. Linnea felt it as a dull ache behind her eyes. Copper grew restless, pacing the chamber, whining at nothing. The wildlife moved. Deer that normally stayed in the high canyons appeared on the wash, moving south. Hawks circled lower than usual. The settlement's dogs barked at shadows. By evening, the temperature had risen to 45 degrees, unseasonably warm, almost pleasant. It felt wrong. Linnea spent the day gathering every piece of fuel she could find. She filled her water skin twice. She checked the firebox, the baffle, the sleeping platform. She tested the draft a dozen times. She was as ready as she would ever be. That night, she lay on the platform with Copper pressed against her side and watched the small fire burn. The smoke rose steadily through the fissure. The stone walls held their warmth. Outside, the stars disappeared one by one as clouds rolled in from the west. She slept badly, waking every few hours to check the fire and listen to the wind. By dawn, the sky was the color of a bruise. November 23rd, 1888. The storm came without warning. One moment, the morning was mild, almost pleasant, shirt-sleeve weather. Linnea was outside the chamber, gathering the last of the deadfall from a nearby slope. Copper trotted beside her, his tongue lolling happily. Then the wind changed. Not gradually, not a slow cooling. A wall. A physical force that slammed into her like a hand pushing her backward. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it on her skin, heat fleeing like something alive. Snow began to fly, not falling, flying, horizontal, driven by a wind that screamed through the canyon like every train in the world arriving at once. The flakes were small and hard, more ice than snow, and they stung wherever they touched exposed skin. Linnea dropped her bundle of wood and ran. Copper stayed with her, ears flat, tail tucked. The entrance to the chamber was 50 yards away. It might as well have been 50 miles. The snow was already so thick she could barely see her hand in front of her face. The wind tried to knock her off her feet with every step. She found the crack in the canyon wall more by memory than sight. She shoved Copper through first, then squeezed in after him, the stones scraping her shoulders, the cold clawing at her back. Inside, she collapsed against the wall, gasping. The chamber was dim, quiet. The roar of the wind was muffled by the stone. Copper shook himself, sending ice crystals flying, then pressed against her legs. Linnea built her fire, small, steady, exactly as Declan had taught her. The smoke rose through the fissure. The stone began to warm. She positioned herself on the sleeping platform and watched the draft. Outside, the storm screamed. The first hours were manageable. The fire burned clean. The smoke rose. The chamber held its warmth. Linnea rationed her fuel carefully, adding small pieces at regular intervals, never letting the flames grow too large or die too low. Copper lay beside her, his head on her lap, his breathing slow and calm. By nightfall, the entrance was drifting shut. She cleared it once, fighting through the wind to push back the snow that was packing against the crack in the rock. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Her lungs burned with every breath. Her fingers went numb in seconds. She retreated inside and let the drift build. If it sealed completely, she would suffocate. If it blocked the draft, the smoke would fill the chamber. But if she kept fighting the snow, she would exhaust herself before dawn. She watched the baffle. The smoke still rose. The fissure was still pulling. The night stretched. Around midnight, something changed. The draft shifted. The steady upward pull became erratic, surging, then stalling, then surging again as the pressure outside changed with the storm. The smoke hesitated at the baffle, curled back, began to drift toward the sleeping platform. Copper coughed. Linnea's eyes stung. She moved without thinking. Declan's voice in her head. A small fire tended steady, but a fire that throws smoke is worse than no fire at all. She pulled 2 stones from the baffle and let the path widen. The smoke found the new gap and climbed. But now the draft was pulling faster, stealing heat before the stone could absorb it. She added a single stone to the firebox mouth, narrowing the opening, slowing the outflow. The smoke hesitated, rose, steadied. She sat back on the sleeping platform, shaking, not from cold, from exhaustion, from the knowledge that she had just fixed something she had not predicted, alone in the dark, with no one to help her. Declan was right. Something always went wrong. She had found out what she was made of. Near dawn, she heard voices. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The storm still howled outside, and she had slept in fragments, waking every hour to check the fire and the drift at the entrance. But the voices were real, muffled by snow and stone, but real. Linnea! She recognized the voice. Orally. Linnea, answer me! She pulled on her coat and crawled toward the entrance. The drift had built to nearly shoulder height, but there was still a gap at the top, still air moving, still faint gray light filtering through. I'm here! She dug at the drift from inside while someone dug from outside. The snow was heavy, packed solid by the wind, and her arms screamed with every handful. When the gap widened enough to see through, she found Orly's face on the other side. Pale, windburned, terrified. Thank God, Orly breathed. Thank God you're alive. What are you doing here? It's not just me. Orly turned and shouted something Linnea could not hear over the wind. A moment later, a small body pushed through the gap. A boy, maybe 7 years old, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. His skin was gray. His lips were blue. He was not shivering anymore. He was past shivering. My brother, Orly said, squeezing through after him. She collapsed against the chamber wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ewan, Silas sent us to fetch a calf before the road closed. The storm caught us halfway. Linnea did not waste time with questions. She pulled Ewan onto the sleeping platform and stripped off his wet clothes. Copper moved immediately to lie beside him, pressing his warm body against the boy's frozen skin. She heated stones near the coals and wrapped them in cloth, placing them against his feet, his hands the small of his back. She pulled him close to the fire, close to the warmth, and held him there while his body slowly remembered how to shiver again. The fire, Orly gasped. Is the fire? The fire's steady. Get his boots off. They worked in silence, the storm screaming outside, the chamber holding its warmth. By the time the gray light of dawn began to filter through the entrance, Ewan's color was returning. He opened his eyes and looked around at the stone walls, the firebox, the sleeping platform, the dog pressed against his side. Where are we? He whispered. Somewhere safe, Linnea said. Go back to sleep. The man who threw her out with $9 was now sending children into a blizzard for a calf, and soon he would be begging for shelter in the hole he called her grave. I want you to think about this. If you were Linnea, would you let him in? Would you save the family of the man who had abandoned you to die? The man who had called you wild and dangerous? The man who had told everyone in the settlement that you were not worth helping? Pause for a moment. Think about what you would do. Then let us continue. An hour before full dawn, more voices came through the storm. This time, Linnea recognized one of them immediately. Gideon Marsh's bass rumble, cutting through the wind like something solid. She crawled to the entrance and found lantern light bleeding through the drift. Men were digging, shovels scraping against packed snow. When the gap opened, Gideon's face appeared. Exhausted, ice-crusted, older than she remembered. Girl, you alive? I'm alive. So is Oralee. So is her brother. Gideon stared at her. The boy is here? Silas sent them to fetch a calf. They didn't make it home. Something moved across Gideon's face. Something that might have been rage, or grief, or the cold finally breaking through his reserves. Silas's cabin is failing. The chinking's gone. The roof's leaking. Half his fuel's too wet to burn. Linnea said nothing. He has the rest of his family in there. His wife. His younger children. They're losing the fight. I heard. His wife. Gideon paused. Hester asked if the girl's cave kept even a little heat. It might save her children. Linnea looked back at the chamber, at the fire burning steady, at Oralee and Ewan huddled on the sleeping platform, at Copper watching with calm, intelligent eyes. The space was small. Adding more bodies would foul the air faster, deplete the fuel, strain everything to its limits. But the alternative was leaving children to freeze in a cabin that was failing. Bring them. They came through the crack one at a time. First, Silas's wife, Hester, a woman Linnea had barely spoken to in all the months since her mother's death. She came through with her youngest child in her arms, a girl of perhaps 3 named Abigail, and she did not look at Linnea as she passed. Then 2 more children, Isaiah, 6 years old, Ruth, 4, both crying, both too cold to cry properly. Then Cordelia Pruitt, the woman who had spread gossip about Linnea eating her dog. She came through with her own 2 children, her face white with fear. Then Gideon carrying a bundle of salvaged fuel. Then last, a body, Declan Morrow. Gideon laid him near the entrance, and Linnea saw the frost on his beard, the blue tinge to his lips. Found him drifted against a wall, Gideon said quietly. He was trying to get here. I think he was trying to check on you. Linnea knelt beside Declan. He was breathing, barely. Shallow rattling breaths that sounded like stones grinding together. Get him to the fire. They made room. They always made room. The chamber that had been built for one now held 9 people. 9 bodies breathing, 9 bodies consuming air and warmth, and Copper moving among them, providing what comfort he could. The smoke began to drift. Linnea saw it immediately. The draft was struggling with too many people exhaling, too much moisture in the air. The careful balance she had built was failing. She moved to the baffle and pulled another stone. The draft surged. The smoke found its path and climbed. But now the fire was burning too hot, eating fuel too fast. She blocked half the firebox opening with a flat stone. The flame shrank. The heat steadied. For the next 6 hours she did not sleep. She did not sit. She watched the smoke and the fire and the draft, adjusting, compensating, fighting the chamber's physics with everything Declan had taught her. The children slept. Hester slept. Cordelia slept. Even Gideon slept, propped against the wall, too exhausted to keep his eyes open. But Linnea watched. Near dawn, the storm began to fade. The screaming wind dropped to a moan, then to a whisper. The snow stopped flying. When the first pale light filtered through the entrance, Linnea looked around the chamber. 9 people alive. Declan's eyes were open. He was watching her. You kept the draft. His voice was barely a whisper. You taught me how. No. He shook his head slowly, each movement an effort. I taught you the pieces. You built the whole. He closed his eyes. The stone kept better sense than the rest of us. When they dug out the entrance at full dawn, the world outside was transformed. Drifts buried the canyon floor. Fences had disappeared. The trail that led to the settlement was gone, erased by 8 feet of wind-packed snow. The cold bit at every inch of exposed skin. But the chamber was warm. The stone walls held their heat. The sleeping platform was dry. The fire still burned, small and steady, exactly as Declan had taught her. Gideon Marsh stood in the center of the chamber and looked at everything. The firebox, the baffle, the stacked fuel, the raised platform, the fissure still pulling air from below. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Linnea. I said stone would kill you. I said a child sleeping in rock in January was a child they'd find frozen by dawn. You did. I was wrong. The words hung in the air. I measured you against what I knew. What I knew was wrong. He offered her his hand. This is not a grave. This is something new. And if you're willing to teach it, there are people who need to learn. Linnea took his hand. Show me how you built this, he said. Because if this works, if this actually works, there are people who need to know. The damage in the settlement was severe. Silas's cabin had lost most of its roof. The walls were cracked. The chinking had blown out in a dozen places. It would take weeks to repair, and weeks of work would not make it safe for winter. Reverend Blackwood's church had lost half its roof. The pews were buried in snow. The altar was frozen. Emmett Holloway's carpentry shop had collapsed entirely. The weight of the snow too much for the roof he had built with his own hands. 3 people were dead. An old miner named Kessler, who had been caught outside checking his claim. A child named Grace Garrett, 5 years old, whose family's dugout had filled with smoke from a fire that threw wrong. A traveler whose name no one knew, found frozen to his horse half a mile from the settlement. Cormac Tully, who had bet $5 that Linnea would be dead before Christmas, had survived. But 3 of his fingers were black with frostbite. They would have to come off. He would never have full use of his right hand again. For a week after the storm, people came to the chamber, not to mock, to ask. First came Orley's mother, the widow Brennan, who had survived 2 winters alone by rationing everything until rationing became a kind of madness. She stood at the entrance and would not go in, but she asked questions for an hour. How deep was the chamber? How did the draft work? Could the same principles apply to a root cellar, to a dugout built into a hillside? Then came the families who had lost livestock, lost roofs, lost faith in the shelters they had built. They wanted to know about the sleeping platform, how raising a bed off the floor could make the difference between waking warm and waking frozen. Then came Emmett Holloway. The carpenter stood in the center of the chamber and looked at everything. His shop was gone. His confidence was gone. Everything he thought he knew about building in this territory had failed the first time it was truly tested. 30 cabins I've built, 19 winters I've survived, and a 14-year-old girl just taught me that everything I thought I knew about keeping warm was incomplete. He looked at the firebox. Show me how you size this. I want to understand. Linnea showed him everything. She did not hoard. She did not bargain. She taught because teaching was how the knowledge survived. Reverend Blackwood came on the 3rd day after the storm. He stood in the entrance of the chamber, his black coat still stained with the snow that had buried his church, and looked at the walls of stone that had kept 9 people alive. I called this the work of creatures forsaken by God. I was the one who was blind. Wisdom doesn't only come from books or pulpits. Sometimes it comes from a mother's last words to her daughter. Cordelia Pruitt came without her gossip. She came without her certainty. She came with red eyes and trembling hands, and she stood in front of the girl she had mocked, and she could not speak. She simply pulled Linnea into an embrace and wept. That was her apology. Linnea understood. Cormac Tully came last. His hand was bandaged. His face was pale. The boy who had bet on her death now stood before her with nothing left of his bravado. I was wrong about everything, except one thing. You're still alive, and I want to know how. Matthias Vance returned to the settlement in early December, his wagon loaded with winter supplies from Flagstaff. He found Linnea teaching a group of settlers how to test draft with burning sage. She did not see him at first. She was too focused on the work, on the smoke rising from a modified root cellar, on the questions being asked by people who had once dismissed her as mad. He waited until the lesson was finished. You're still alive, he said. Linnea turned. You sound surprised. I'm not. He pulled something from his coat pocket, another bundle of wax-dipped matches. For next winter. You don't have to keep bringing me matches. I know. He did not leave that evening, or the next. He helped her gather fuel. He helped her expand the outer woodpile. He asked questions about the firebox, the baffle, the draft, and he listened to the answers in a way that told her he was not just being polite. Why do you care? She asked him one evening as they sat near the entrance of the chamber watching the sunset over the canyon. Because you built something that should not have worked, and it worked anyway. He looked at her. I've been driving freight for 6 years. I've seen a lot of people try things that should not work. Most of them fail. You didn't. I had help. Everyone has help. The question is what you do with it. Copper, lying between them, wagged his tail. Declan Morrow did not survive the winter. The cold had settled into his lungs during the hours he spent drifted against the canyon wall, trying to reach the chamber, trying to check on the girl he had taught. By the time Gideon carried him inside, the damage was done. He lived for 6 more weeks. During those weeks, he and Linnea worked together in ways they had not before. Not teacher and student now, partners, collaborators. 2 people building something neither could build alone. They refined the portable firebox design. They documented the principles of draft management. They created drawings that could be copied and shared. "You're thinking like a mason now," Declan said one afternoon, watching her select stones from a pile. "Not just building, designing, seeing the whole before you start the pieces. You taught me that. I showed you the door. You walk through yourself." He died on a clear morning in late January. Linnea found him in his lean-to, sitting upright against the wall, his hands folded in his lap. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had finished his work. She sat with him for a long time before she told anyone. The canyon was quiet. The snow had settled into a hard crust that glittered in the winter sun. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. She buried him on the hillside above his lean-to, the ground too frozen for proper depth. Come spring, she would dig deeper. For now, the stones she piled over him would keep the animals away. Copper sat beside her the entire time, not moving, not making a sound. When she finished, she stood looking down at the grave for a long moment. "The chain won't break," she said quietly. "I promise." Then she walked back to the chamber and built a fire exactly the way he had taught her. Small, steady, tended with patience. The smoke rose through the fissure and disappeared into the cold blue sky. "Before we finish, I want to ask you something. What is one piece of knowledge that was passed down to you from a parent, a grandparent, or someone who changed your life? Something that seemed simple at the time, but shaped who you became. Share it in the comments. Let us keep the chain unbroken." Spring came slowly to the canyon country. The snow retreated in stages, revealing the damage of the winter. Collapsed fences, scattered debris, the shallow graves of livestock that had not survived. But it also revealed something else, a settlement that had changed. Root cellars were being modified with vent holes and bafflestones. Dugouts were being rebuilt with proper draft paths. 3 families had already constructed versions of Linnea's portable firebox, adapted for their own spaces. The knowledge was spreading. Linnea found herself in demand in ways she had never anticipated. Settlers she had never met sought her out to ask about smoke management, about sleeping platforms, about the strange wisdom of building warmth into stone. She answered every question. She visited every site. She taught everyone who wanted to learn. "You should charge for this," Orly said one evening, after a particularly long session with 3 families who had come together. "You could make real money. Money runs out. Knowledge spreads. That's not practical. Neither was surviving in a hole in the ground." Orly had no answer for that. She had become something different since the storm. She had watched her brother nearly die in Linnea's arms. She had seen the chamber hold when everything else failed. The practical skeptic had converted, quietly, without fanfare. A week after the snow began to melt, Orly appeared at the chamber entrance with a candle stub and a piece of charred wood. "Teach me the smoke test." Linnea did not ask why. She simply showed her. They spent an afternoon in the Brennan family's root cellar, testing the airflow, finding the dead spots where smoke pooled, and the live channels where it moved. By evening, Orly could read a draft almost as well as Linnea could. "I told you that you were burying yourself," Orly said as they walked back toward the canyon in the fading light. "I told you no one would hear you cough. You were worried. Worry isn't the same as doubt. I doubted. I doubted hard." She stopped walking. "I thought you were going to die, and I thought it would be my fault for not stopping you. It wouldn't have been your fault. I know that now, but I didn't know it then." She looked at Linnea. "How did you know? How did you know it would work when everyone told you it would fail?" "I didn't know. I hoped, and I worked. And when I was wrong about something, I fixed it before it killed me. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." The confrontation with Silas came in early March. He appeared at the crack in the canyon wall without warning. He did not call out. He did not announce himself. He simply stood there, looking at the entrance to the shelter that had saved his wife and children, and waited. Linnea found him when she emerged to gather fuel. Copper growled low in his throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Your firebox," Silas said finally. His voice was different, smaller. "The one in the chamber, the way you built it." He stopped, swallowed. "My hearth is failing. The stones are cracking. The smoke's getting worse." "I know, Hester told me." "She told you?" "She came to ask how to fix it. I told her what to do. She said you wouldn't listen." "She said you wouldn't listen." Silas's jaw tightened. Linnea watched the struggle play out across his face. Pride against need, resentment against desperation. "I'm listening now." It was not an apology. It was not acknowledgement. It was not anything except a man who had run out of options, asking for help from the girl he had thrown away. Linnea could have refused. She could have made him beg. She could have extracted payment or labor or a public admission of what he had done. Instead, she picked up her gathering sack and said, "Show me the hearth." She spent 2 days at Silas's cabin. She did not speak to him more than necessary. She did not eat at his table or sleep under his roof. She came in the morning, worked until dark, and returned to her chamber at night. But she fixed his hearth. She tore out the cracked stones and replaced them with properly bedded ones. She built a baffle where he had none. She tested the draft and adjusted the firebox opening until the smoke rose clean. On the second evening, as she prepared to leave, Silas stopped her at the door. "Why?" Linnea turned. "Why what?" "Why help me? After what I did?" Linnea looked at him, at the man who had handed her $9 and told her to disappear, who had sent children into a blizzard for a calf, who had spread rumors that she was wild and dangerous and probably a thief. "Because your children live in that house, and your children didn't throw me out." She left him standing in the doorway and did not look back. The years that followed compressed the way years do when they are full. Linnea married Matthias Vance in the spring of 1892. She was 18 years old. The ceremony was small. The celebration was quiet. But the community that gathered was real. People who had learned from her. People who had survived because of what she taught. People who saw her not as the wild girl in the stone grave, but as something else entirely. A teacher, a builder, a keeper of knowledge that mattered. They built a workshop together, Linnea and Matthias, a larger space with a proper stone hearth. Room enough for two to live and work. Not a cabin in the conventional sense. Something better. Something that used everything Linnea had learned about warmth and stone and enclosed air. Children came. 2 daughters born in that workshop with its steady warmth. They grew up knowing how to read smoke before they knew how to read words. They knew the principles of the baffle before they knew the alphabet. Matthias continued his freight work, but now he carried Linnea's knowledge along with his cargo. Every supply station on his route was rebuilt. Every camp manager learned the principles. The death rate in winter quarters dropped to nearly nothing. Gideon Marsh died in the winter of 1894, caught by a sudden storm on his last supply run. They found him in his wagon, frozen at the reins, one hand still holding the leads. At his funeral, Linnea spoke. "He was the first person to admit he was wrong about me. That admission cost him nothing but pride, and pride is the cheapest thing a person can spend." Astrid Lindqvist died at 89, peaceful in her sleep. The last words she spoke to Linnea, a week before she passed, were simple and direct. "The chain didn't break. You kept it whole." Copper lived to be 14 years old. He had grown old the way good dogs grow old, slowly and with dignity. His muzzle had gone white. His eyes had clouded. His crooked ear, the one that had never quite stood straight, drooped lower with each passing year. But he still followed Linnea everywhere she went. He still lay at the foot of her bed. He still watched over her daughters the way he had once watched over her. On his last morning, in the spring of 1902, he walked to his favorite spot near the fire, the place where the stones held warmth longest, and lay down with a sigh. Linnea knew. She had seen enough death to recognize when it was coming. She set aside her work and sat down beside him, her hand on his head, feeling the slow rhythm of his breathing. "You were there," she said quietly. "From the beginning. when no one else was. Copper's tail moved once, a small wag, the last one he had to give. I would have died in that canyon without you, not from cold, from loneliness. She stayed with him until his breathing stopped. They buried him on the hillside next to Declan Morrow. In a grave Linnea dug herself the way she had once dug her mother's grave. Her daughters helped carry stones for the cairn. Matthias stood by with his hat in his hands. The marker she placed was small but carefully chosen. A flat piece of sandstone, the same red color as his fur. Copper. He kept her warm when no one else would. For a long time after, Linnea would catch herself looking for him, expecting to see a rust-colored shape at the edge of her vision, expecting to hear claws clicking on the floor behind her. The workshop felt larger without him. The world felt larger without him. Linnea Whitmore Vance died on a clear morning in the spring of 1915. She was 41 years old. She died in the workshop she and Matthias had built together, surrounded by her daughters and grandchildren, who knew her principles the way they knew their own names. The consumption that had taken her mother finally came for her too. It had been years in arriving, but it arrived all the same. In her last weeks, she returned often to the chamber in the canyon wall. It was too small for her now. Her knees complained at the squeeze through the entrance. Her back ached on the sleeping platform that had once felt like luxury. But she came anyway. She sat by the firebox she had built at 14 and watched the smoke rise through the fissure the way it had risen on that first terrifying night. The stone remembered everything. The soot marks on the baffle, the wear patterns on the sleeping platform, the place where Declan had stood when he told her she listened better than any apprentice he had ever had. I kept my promise, she said quietly to the empty chamber. The chain didn't break. She was buried on the hillside next to Copper and Declan, overlooking the wash where she had first found the crack in the canyon wall. The stone they placed on her grave was sandstone from the chamber itself, a flat slab that had once been part of the baffle, worn smooth by decades of smoke and heat. The inscription was simple: Linnea Whitmore Vance, 1874 to 1915. She taught us how to keep warm. In 1987, researchers from Northern Arizona University discovered the chamber while surveying historical sites in the canyon country. They found the remains of the firebox, still standing after nearly a century. They found the baffle, still positioned to guide rising heat toward the venting fissure. They found the stone piers of the sleeping platform, exactly 18 inches high. They measured, they tested, they documented the principles Linnea had used: the thermal mass of enclosed stone, the draft management through strategic venting, the elevation of sleeping surfaces above cold floor air, matched exactly the principles used in modern passive heating design. The chamber was added to the Arizona Historical Registry. A small plaque was placed at the entrance. This site represents one of the earliest documented examples of passive geothermal heating in North American frontier architecture. According to local records, it was designed and constructed in 1888 by Linnea Whitmore, age 14, using techniques passed down from Norwegian building traditions. In the canyon country of northern Arizona, the winters still come hard and fast. The temperature still drops 40 degrees between afternoon and midnight. The snow still buries trails and fences and anything left unprotected. The cold still kills anyone who underestimates it. But in the settlements that spread across that country in the decades after 1888, something had changed. Root cellars had baffles. Dugouts had vents. Camp shelters burned a fraction of the fuel they once consumed. And everyone knew why. When children in those settlements complained about the cold, their parents told them the story about the 14-year-old thrown out with $9 in a flour sack, about the chamber she found in the firebox she built, about the night when she held 9 people alive in a space meant for one, while the worst storm in a decade tried to kill them all. And when those children grew and had children of their own, they told the story again. On November 23, 1888, Gideon Marsh had looked at a girl sitting on a boulder in the canyon and delivered a verdict that seemed as solid as the stone around them. A child sleeping in stone in January is a child they'll find frozen by dawn. He was not wrong about the danger. He was not wrong about the cold, or the impossibility of what she was attempting, or the arithmetic of survival in country that did not forgive mistakes. He was only wrong about her. When the men of the settlement pushed through the drifted entrance of her chamber, On that frozen November morning, they did not find a body. They found a firebox burning steady. They found children asleep on a raised platform, warm enough that their breath did not cloud in the air. They found a 14-year-old girl who had spent the night adjusting stones and reading smoke, fighting the physics of winter with everything she had learned in 2 months of desperate work. The cliff that was supposed to bury her became the first roof that ever held, and the smoke still rises through that fissure in the canyon wall, a thread of gray against the blue winter sky, if you know where to look. This story is dedicated to every piece of wisdom passed down through generations, to the mothers who taught their daughters, to the mentors who saw potential where others saw impossibility, to everyone who has ever been told they would fail and chose to prove otherwise. The chain does not have to break. Pass it on. The end.